Hi everyone, here we are in week 10. This week we're looking specifically at the presidencies of John Quincy Adams, who is the nation's sixth president, and Andrew Jackson, who is the nation's seventh president. John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams, who was the second president. And this is sort of a moment in history that's being relived as we speak. Andrew Jackson has gained quite a bit of notoriety lately as his portrait was added to the Oval Office by President Trump when President Trump took over the Oval Office. And as you're reading the Foreigner chapter this week, this might sound This might sound familiar to you, as you see John Quincy Adams, a former Secretary of State and who many people said was the most prepared to be president, going up against Andrew Jackson, who has little political experience and has the backing of what he calls the common man, the common people. And so a lot of historians specifically saw the 2016 presidential election um, very similar to that of the presidential elections between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So you'll kind of see that connection there. Um, but we'll also spend the majority of your time really looking at the Jackson presidency because it is a transformational presidency. And I think you'll see that as you watch this PBS documentary that I have for you on Andrew Jackson's life. This does give you an entire overview of Jackson's life. I'm most concerned that you have the knowledge about his presidency. There's two specific details of his presidency that I'd like you to really zero in on during your watching of this film. The first has to do with the Indian Removal Act. And so I'd like you to pay attention to the details that describe the forced migration of Native Americans off their lands into the Western territories by Andrew Jackson. And as you're paying attention to that, I'd like you to sort of keep in mind who the tribes are, which tribes are being moved, and then the back and forth between Andrew Jackson and the Indian tribes, but also the Native American tribes and their sort of sense of agency in formulating plans to push back against Jackson, but also their sense of agency or power in lawsuits. And so I'd like you to pay attention to the role of the courts when it comes to the Indian Removal Act, and specifically how Jackson responds to the courts when they give him pushback on the Indian Removal Act. The second part of the video and the readings that I'd like you to pay attention to deal with Jackson's bank war. Um, just a lot of times when I talk about Jackson, for some reason my mind always says Jefferson. So if you hear me talking about Jefferson at all in this video, I actually mean Jackson. And if you're following along pretty closely, you can tell that I'm always pausing to make sure I say Jackson. So this week, Jackson. We'll keep Jefferson to the side. I do have one thing to say about Jefferson, and I'll make sure that. So I want you to pay attention to the bank war and how Jackson took it upon himself to end the second Bank of the United States. If you remember, the Bank of the United States was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, what he really pushed for. It had to be upped in 1816 under James Madison's presidency, and now it's going to be up for debate again for the presidential election of 1836, it would seem like, because that's when it's actually up for renegotiation. But Jackson makes it a major plank of his reelection in 1832. So we want to kind of see Jackson's role in the bank and his dismantling of the bank. So as you watch the video, please keep those two ideas in mind. The readings this week, please read chapter 10 from the Foner book. And we're going to be talking about Jacksonian democracy and how Jackson basically reignites this idea of democracy, bringing democracy to the common man and sort of pulling out the elite of the American government and restoring the common man. And that sounds really good, and in some cases, Jackson is able to accomplish that, but in many cases, Jackson is not able to accomplish that. And that's sort of the third thing I'd like you to pay attention to in the PBS video is how is it that Jackson basically falls into the same old um, political ideas of Washington, D.C. And I think his personal story is really quite fascinating. I think that you'll find the story of his wife and the story of his niece to be quite fascinating when it comes to Jackson and his role in Washington, D.C. So please read chapter 10 of the Foner book, but also please read these documents here. I do want to take just a moment to work through them. So there is a letter from Thomas Jefferson, which is much earlier. We're right now in the Jackson period, which is the late 1820s to the 1830s. But I'm giving you this letter now because I would like you to compare Jefferson's plan for dealing with Native Americans to what Jackson comes up with. Jefferson and Jackson politically are not that far apart. I think what's going to separate, what I would say separates these two, is that Jefferson is a man of learning, is a man who really values learning and the elite. Jackson, sort of the opposite of that, but they both really sort of find the strength in the common man, the idea of the common man. So I would like you to pay attention to what Jefferson's plan is for the Native Americans. And the thing that you pay most attention to is this word debt. And so as you're reading this, figure out why Jefferson is interested in Native Americans in debt, and then what would be the results for Native Americans if they were to go into debt. So that should be a significant question that you try to answer by the time you're done reading that document. The Monroe Doctrine seems a little bit out of place here, but we sort of need this background. The Monroe Doctrine is written by John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State to James Monroe. And so I would like you to keep this in mind for your final exam, because your final exam is going to sort of be a takeoff of the Monroe Doctrine. And so I would like you to have a good reading of this and have a sense of what the Monroe Doctrine is arguing, so that for your final exam, you're going to be able to sort of use this as a jumping off point. Your final exam is going to deal with foreign affairs. And so I would like you to sort of, from this point forward, kind of keep things in the back of your mind that deal with foreign countries and the United States and how the United States deals with foreign countries. And so the Monroe Doctrine will be a good starting place for that. The rest of the documents are going to have to do with the Native Americans. So this one is a speech to Governor William Henry Harrison. So Governor William Henry Harrison of Ohio. If the name sounds familiar to you, William Henry Harrison was the nation's 9th president. So he's going to be coming up. And when we see his presidency, you'll notice that William Henry Harrison was the shortest serving president of the United States. He caught a severe cold at his inauguration. He refused to wear an overcoat to his inauguration, catches cold, and dies 1 month after taking the oath of office. But before Harrison becomes president, he does serve as a governor, and he receives this speech from Tecumseh, and Tecumseh is a leader of the Shawnees. And so I want you to see what Tecumseh's statement is to William Henry Harrison. You'll notice that he's referring to him as brother. And so this is Tecumseh, the Native American leader from the Shawnee tribe, speaking to William Henry Harrison. So that should give you some context for that speech. The last document is from Andrew Jackson, and it's him explaining the Indian Removal Act in the 1830s. And so I have underlined a section that I would like you to pay specific attention to, but I would like you to read the whole document and to have a sense of what Andrew Jackson is telling Congress about Indian removal. After you've read those documents, I would like you to participate in this week's discussion 10. And so what I'm asking for you to do here is read Jefferson's letter about Native Americans, read the speech from Tecumseh to William Henry Harrison, and read Jackson's Indian Removal Act. And so when you read these three plans, I would like you to write me up a little summary, it should be 200 words in length, that describes what these three plans, what these three documents have in common, but also what makes them different. And then, as I mentioned, I do want you to sort of zero in on Jackson's report of Indian removal to the Congress. And I'd like you to sort of think about what Jackson has to say about it, and then compare that to what you actually see in the PBS documentary about what Indian removal looks like. So, is Jackson being straightforward with Congress, or is the aftermath of this Indian removal different from what Jackson sees and expects to have happen? So, that's what you should be keeping in mind for this week's discussion. Things have been looking good. Discussion forums lately have been fantastic. So good that I haven't felt like I needed to jump in. I have a couple times maybe tried to correct people of certain things, but I've been blown away by your discussion forum postings. You'll have your first writing assignments back by Wednesday of this week. I'm just about done grading those, and those should be all set. And so I look forward to having some more conversations and seeing what you come up with. Have a good week.